She bought a strange house that everyone else had rejected. The plan was simple: tear it down and make money. But after the purchase, things didn't go according to plan, and this house changed her life. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. She had learned, over years in real estate, to trust numbers more than impressions. Numbers did not care about weather, nostalgia, or what neighbors whispered behind their hands. Numbers spoke clearly. This one, printed in black ink on a foreclosure notice, told her everything she needed to know. The price was absurdly low. Low enough to justify a drive into the countryside she rarely visited. Low enough to make even a tired, cautious agent like her stop and look twice. The property had been on the bank's books for years. No buyers, no bids. Each quarter it was listed again, the price quietly lowered, the description stripped of adjectives until it was reduced to bare facts. Rural parcel, residential zoning, structure present, as is. As is meant trouble. She knew that better than most. But it also meant opportunity, if you had the patience and the capital to reshape the problem into something the market could understand. She told herself she was not attached to the idea. She would inspect it, nothing more. A professional courtesy to her own instincts. The drive took longer than expected. Paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt, then gravel, then a narrow stretch where weeds pressed in from both sides, brushing the undercarriage of her car. Cell service flickered and vanished. That alone would scare off half her usual clients. She noticed it with a detached irritation, the same way one notices a typo in a document that is already destined for the shredder. When she finally saw the house, she stopped the car without realizing she had done so. It did not look like a house in the way modern listings promised houses should look. There was no proud facade, no clear separation between roof and ground. The structure seemed to crouch against the earth, as if bracing itself. Thick log walls emerged from the soil, darkened by age and weather, and above them, the roof sloped down at such a low angle that it nearly met the ground on both sides. Snow from an earlier storm still clung to its surface, melting slowly, feeding narrow streams of water into the frozen dirt below. Her first thought was that it looked unfinished. Her second was that it looked wrong. She stepped out of the car, the cold biting through her coat. The air smelled clean and sharp, untouched by traffic or industry. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, the sound thin and solitary. The house made no sound at all. She walked around it, boots crunching over frost. There were no decorative elements, no attempt to charm or impress. Everything about the structure spoke of utility. Thick timbers, small windows set deep into the walls, a low entrance sheltered by the overhanging roof. It was a building that seemed to have been designed not to be seen, but to endure. A local man had warned her about it when she mentioned the address at a gas station an hour earlier. Shook his head, said no one ever stayed there long, said it wasn't worth fixing, said it had been a mistake even when it was new. Mistake was a word she understood well. She had spent years correcting other people's mistakes for a fee. Inside, the air was colder, but not hostile. The space was simple, almost austere. A single main room, a smaller adjoining space that might once have been used for storage or sleeping, a hearth built of stone that bore the scars of decades of fires. The walls were thick enough that she could feel their solidity when she pressed her palm against them. There was no sense of fragility here. If anything, the house felt stubborn. She walked slowly, mentally cataloging what would need to be done. Electrical overhaul, plumbing update. Insulation, if any existed, would be inadequate by modern standards. The roof would never pass inspection in its current form. Any buyer with a mortgage would be impossible. Cash only, and even then, unlikely. But the land was decent. That, at least, was undeniable. Enough space for a modern build. Something clean and efficient. Something that would photograph well and sell quickly once the permits were secured. The old house could be demolished, its materials cleared away, its footprint erased. In its place, she could put something the market understood. Standing in the center of the room, she imagined it already gone. The house reduced to a line item in a construction budget. Demolition cost, site prep, new foundation, new framing. She felt a familiar sense of control return, the comfort of a plan taking shape. She bought the property 2 weeks later. The paperwork was surprisingly straightforward, though that alone should have warned her. The bank wanted it off their books. The county clerk barely glanced at the address. No one asked her why she wanted it. No one tried to talk her out of it. It was as if the house had already been forgotten by the systems meant to track such things. She told herself she would not linger. The purchase was an investment, not a commitment. She would not move there. She would not allow herself to think of it as anything other than a temporary inconvenience on the way to profit. Back in the city, her other projects demanded attention, or at least they should have. Meetings were postponed. Emails went unanswered. One permit was delayed, then another. A new zoning interpretation emerged from the county office, rendering months of preparation suddenly obsolete. An investor grew cautious, then silent. Another asked to renegotiate terms, citing market uncertainty. She assured herself it was temporary. The market always corrected itself. It had done so before. She had built her career on anticipating those corrections. Still, at night, she found herself thinking of the house. Not fondly, but persistently. Its low roof, its refusal to conform, the way it seemed to press itself into the ground, as if drawing strength from it. When she returned for a second visit, this time with a notebook and camera, the weather had turned. A cold rain fell steadily, soaking the ground, turning the narrow road into mud. She watched water slide down the slope of the roof and disappear into the earth, not pooling, not freezing. She noted it without comment, filed it away as a curiosity. Inside, the house smelled faintly of smoke and old wood. She stood by the hearth, imagining it rebuilt, modernized, encased in drywall and steel. The image felt oddly unsatisfying. She shook the thought away. Sentiment had no place here. Houses did not have personalities. They were assets, liabilities, or opportunities. Nothing more. She locked the door behind her and returned to the city, already drafting emails to contractors, already calculating costs. The house, she was certain, would not be the story. It was merely the setting for a transaction yet to be completed. She did not know then that it was the only project she had left that would not collapse under the weight of paperwork and waiting. She did not know that the house she intended to erase would become the one thing that remained when everything else began to fall apart. For now, it was simply a problem to be solved, a structure no one wanted, sitting quietly in the cold, waiting. In the weeks that followed her purchase of the house, she continued to live as she always had, moving through the city with practiced efficiency, answering calls, attending meetings, opening folders that multiplied faster than they closed. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. She was still the woman who arrived prepared, who spoke with quiet authority, who knew which regulations mattered and which could be negotiated away with time and persistence. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, something had begun to loosen. The first delay came without drama. A permit that should have been approved within days was pushed back for review. No explanation, just a polite notice from the county office citing updated compliance standards. She read it twice, then forwarded it to her assistant with a brief note. Adjust the timeline. Reconfirm requirements. This happened often enough that it barely registered as a warning. The second delay followed a week later, then a third. Each one seemed reasonable on its own, supported by language that suggested diligence rather than obstruction. Together, they formed a pattern she did not like. Meetings were rescheduled, then rescheduled again. A planner she had worked with for years sounded distracted on the phone, as if already preparing her for disappointment. She began to spend more time driving between offices, waiting in hallways lined with framed notices and faded maps. She watched other applicants sit with stacks of paper on their laps, their expressions a mixture of hope and resignation. She recognized that look. It was the look of people learning that the system did not care how carefully they had planned. One afternoon, after a meeting that produced nothing but another list of documents to be obtained, she returned to her car and sat without starting the engine. The city noise pressed in around her, horns and engines and distant sirens, all of it suddenly exhausting. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel and closed her eyes, telling herself she was only tired. Her phone vibrated. An investor's name flashed on the screen. She answered with her usual calm, already forming reassurances. The conversation was brief, courteous, final. The investor had decided to step back, citing uncertainty and prolonged timelines. He wished her well. She ended the call and stared at the dashboard. The word "step back" echoed in her mind, stripped of its politeness. It meant withdrawal. It meant less capital, less leverage. It meant that a project she had counted on to stabilize the others was now another liability. She told herself it was still manageable. She had weathered slowdowns before. The market was cyclical. The system corrected itself eventually. All she needed was time. But time, she was beginning to understand, was no longer entirely hers. Bills continued to arrive with steady indifference. Insurance, loan payments, fees. Each one was small enough not to alarm her, but together they formed a quiet pressure that followed her through her days. She found herself recalculating figures she had once considered settled, adjusting projections late into the night. It was then that she returned, in her thoughts, to the house. At first, it was only as a line in her accounts, a property she could liquidate if necessary, even at a loss. She pulled up the listing she had never officially published, reading it with a more critical eye. Rural property. Old structure. As is. She revised the language, softened it, added photographs taken in better light. She priced it aggressively, low enough to attract curiosity. The response was immediate in its absence. Days passed without inquiries. A week, then 2. She refreshed the listing, adjusted the price again, waited. When a message finally arrived, her hope flared briefly before extinguishing itself. The sender asked only about the land, then disappeared when she explained that the structure was included. Another asked if demolition permits were already secured. When she said they were not, he wished her luck. She drove out to the property again, this time not as an owner with plans, but as a seller confronting reality. The road seemed worse than she remembered, the ruts deeper, the mud thicker. She imagined potential buyers making the same drive, turning back before they reached the end. The house looked unchanged, still crouched against the land, indifferent to her concerns. She walked around it slowly, noting how the rain from the previous days had drained away without leaving pools. The ground near the foundation was firm. The roofline, low as it was, showed no signs of sagging. She stood there longer than she intended, hands in her pockets, staring at a building she had already decided to erase. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something like irritation directed not at the house, but at herself. She had assumed too much, assumed the system would bend, that money and experience would smooth the path forward. Back in the city, the situation worsened. Another partner called, this one less careful with his words. He could not afford to wait. He needed to move his resources elsewhere. She understood. She always did. Understanding did not make it easier. She began to cancel expenses that had once felt untouchable. Dinners out became rare. Subscriptions were paused. She moved money from one account to another, buying herself weeks instead of months. The sense of control she had always maintained slipped, replaced by a constant awareness of time passing. One evening, after reviewing her accounts yet again, she closed her laptop and sat in silence. The apartment around her felt suddenly excessive. Too much space, too many things that needed cleaning, maintaining, paying for. She thought of the house, its single main room, its thick walls. The thought was not comforting, but it was persistent. The idea of demolition, once so clear, now felt impossibly distant. Contractors required deposits she could no longer justify. Permits were uncertain, even for removal. The county, it seemed, had little interest in accelerating any process that involved that address. She made a list, short and unadorned. Sell the house, demolish the house, build new. Each option ended in the same place, a column of numbers that did not add up. It was then that she considered what she had avoided acknowledging, the possibility that she would need to stay there. The word temporary echoed in her mind as she packed a small bag. Temporary did not mean defeat. It meant adaptation. She told herself she would live there just long enough to reduce expenses, to wait out the delays, to regain footing. She would not let it change her. The drive out felt different this time, less hurried, more deliberate. She brought groceries, blankets, a space heater she suspected she would not need, but carried anyway. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the house greeted her with the same cool stillness as before. She lit a fire in the hearth, more out of habit than necessity. The flames caught quickly, the chimney drawing well. The warmth spread slowly, evenly, without the abrupt blasts she was used to from modern systems. She sat on a simple chair and watched the fire until the tension in her shoulders eased despite herself. Night fell early. Outside, the wind rose, pushing against the roof, sliding over it rather than catching. She listened, waiting for rattling, for the creaks and groans she associated with old buildings. There were none. The house remained steady, unmoved. Lying on a narrow bed later, wrapped in blankets, she stared up at the low ceiling. The house smelled faintly of wood and smoke. It did not feel like home. Not yet. But it didn't feel hostile either. As sleep finally claimed her, she thought of the life she had built, the deals that had defined her sense of worth. She thought of the systems she had trusted to support her ambitions. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, a quiet realization settled in. The market was not going to rescue her. The system was not going to hurry on her behalf. For the first time, the house was no longer merely a problem to be solved. It was a place she would have to endure, whether she wanted to or not. She woke before dawn on her third morning in the house, not because of noise or cold, but because of an unfamiliar stillness. In the city, even at its quietest hours, there had always been a low hum beneath everything. Distant traffic, heating systems clicking on and off, the faint echo of other lives stacked above and below her own. Here, there was nothing. The silence was so complete that it felt almost physical, as if it pressed gently against her ears. For a moment she lay still, listening for something to break it. Wind, perhaps, or the creak of settling wood. But the house remained quiet, solid, uninterested in announcing itself. She swung her legs out of bed and felt the coolness of the floorboards beneath her feet. The air was cold, but not biting. She exhaled and watched her breath, expecting it to cloud heavily, but it barely showed. That surprised her enough to make her pause. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers sometime in the night. She knelt, stirred them, added a log. The flame caught easily, as it had the night before, and soon the soft heat began to spread again. She wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee and stood there, waiting for the familiar ache of cold that never quite arrived. She told herself not to read too much into it. Old houses could be unpredictable. One warm night meant nothing in the long run. Still, as the days passed, a pattern began to form. Outside, winter was tightening its grip. The ground stayed frozen well past midday. Snow fell, melted, then fell again, layering itself along the low slope of the roof. Wind swept across the open land, sharp and relentless. She watched it from the small window, expecting to feel its presence inside as well. She did not. The house held. The walls, thick with timber and packed clay, seemed to absorb the cold rather than surrender to it. The roof, so low she could almost touch it from the ground outside, offered no edge for the wind to catch. Instead of howling or rattling, the gusts slid over it, as water slides over stone. She began to notice details she had ignored before. How the windows were set deep into the walls, creating pockets of shadow and insulation. How the entrance was sheltered beneath the roof's overhang, forcing snow and rain to fall away from the door rather than against it. How the hearth was positioned at the heart of the structure, its warmth radiating outward evenly instead of fighting to reach distant corners. In the evenings, she found herself sitting longer by the fire, not out of necessity, but out of curiosity. She watched how the heat lingered, how the temperature dropped slowly once the flames died down, instead of plummeting all at once. It was the opposite of her apartment in the city, where a malfunctioning thermostat or brief outage could turn a room cold within minutes. She thought of the sleek homes she had sold over the years. Clean lines, open floor plans, walls of glass that looked stunning in photographs and demanded constant energy to maintain. She had praised their efficiency, their modern systems, their promise of convenience. Here, there were no systems to speak of, no screens, no digital controls. And yet, the house worked. The realization unsettled her more than the cold ever could have. During the day, she ventured outside, clearing snow from the path, stacking firewood beneath the shelter formed by the roof's downward slope. She worked slowly, unused to physical labor, her muscles protesting in quiet, insistent ways. Each task left her tired, but it was a clean kind of exhaustion, unaccompanied by the mental fog that usually followed long days of emails and negotiations. She noticed how the ground near the house stayed less frozen than the surrounding field, how water drained away naturally instead of pooling, how even after heavy snowfall, the area beneath the roof remained relatively clear. The structure did not fight the environment, it adapted to it. At night, lying in bed, she found her thoughts drifting back through time. She imagined the people who had built this place, though she knew nothing about them. They had not designed it to impress or to sell. They had not worried about resale value or market trends. They had built it to survive winters like this one, winters that did not care about aesthetics. For the first time, she felt something dangerously close to respect. That respect was not comfortable. It challenged too much of what she believed. She had built her life on the idea that progress meant replacing old solutions with new ones, that modernity was inherently superior. Standing in that house, warm while the world outside froze, that certainty began to erode. She tried to dismiss the thought, telling herself she was romanticizing out of isolation. Anyone could grow sentimental when cut off from familiar comforts. But the house did not invite sentiment. It offered no softness, no charm. It was plain, almost severe. And yet it was effective. One afternoon, she drove into the nearest town to pick up supplies. At the small hardware store, she overheard two men talking about a recent cold snap. One complained about frozen pipes, another about heating costs that had doubled in a single month. She listened quietly, feeling a strange, reluctant sense of detachment. Back at the house, she checked the interior walls, half expecting to find moisture or cracks. There were none. The temperature inside remained steady, predictable. She began to trust it in small ways, letting the fire burn lower at night, testing how far she could rely on the structure itself. Each small act of trust brought with it a subtle shift. She stopped thinking of the house as temporary, not consciously, not yet. But in the way she arranged her few belongings, in the way she repaired a loose hinge instead of ignoring it, something changed. The house responded in its own way, by continuing to do what it had always done. It sheltered her. It conserved heat. It endured. She began to understand that this place was not an accident, was not the result of ignorance or lack of resources. It was the product of a logic different from her own, a logic shaped by necessity rather than ambition. That realization followed her into sleep one night as a storm gathered outside. Snow fell heavily, driven by wind that howled across the land. She woke briefly to the sound of it brushing against the roof, a soft, continuous whisper. The house did not shake. It did not complain. Wrapped in blankets, she listened, aware that in the city such a storm would have meant warnings, delays, disruptions. Here, it was simply weather. When morning came, the world outside was transformed, buried beneath white. The house emerged from it like a living thing, its roof shedding snow, its entrance clear. She stood in the doorway, staring out at the frozen landscape, and felt a sense of stability she had not known in months. The market had failed her, the system had stalled. But this house, dismissed and unwanted, continued to function with quiet reliability. She closed the door against the cold and turned back inside, carrying with her the first real doubt she had ever felt about the logic she had built her life upon. By the time she met the couple, winter had settled into the land with quiet authority. The storms no longer surprised her. Snow came and went, the sky shifting from dull gray to sharp blue, the cold steady and uncompromising. She had fallen into a rhythm dictated less by clocks than by daylight and weather. Mornings began with fire and coffee, days with small, necessary tasks that kept the house and herself in order. It was a life stripped of excess, and though she would not have admitted it aloud, it steadied her. She first noticed them one afternoon while clearing snow near the edge of her property. Two figures moved slowly along the road, bundled against the cold, their steps careful. They stopped when they saw her, hesitation plain even from a distance. She straightened, brushing snow from her gloves, and waited. The man spoke first, his voice tentative, but polite. They lived on the neighboring land, he said, farther down the road where the trees thickened. They had seen her lights at night, the smoke from her chimney. They wanted to introduce themselves, nothing more. She listened, nodding, aware of how long it had been since anyone had addressed her without expectation. Their names came and went, simple, unremarkable. They were older than she had thought at first glance, their movements slowed by age rather than cold alone. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her scarf. They spoke for a few minutes about the weather, about the road, about how harsh the winter had been so far. Ordinary things. As they turned to leave, the man hesitated, then added something that made her pause. They were having trouble, he said. With paperwork? She had heard that word so often it barely registered as a threat anymore. Paperwork was an inconvenience, a delay, something to be managed. But the way he said it, quietly, with a careful lack of detail, suggested something else. She asked a question she would not have asked weeks earlier. What kind of trouble? They exchanged a glance. The woman answered this time, her voice thin but steady. Old documents, land boundaries that no longer matched the county records. Back taxes they did not understand how to resolve. Letters they barely knew how to read, let alone answer correctly. They had lived on their land for decades, she said, longer than any map suggested they should. Now they were being told it might not be theirs. The words settled heavily in the cold air. She felt, unexpectedly, a sharp flare of anger that surprised her with its intensity, not at the couple, but at the faceless system she knew so well. The same system that had stalled her projects, that had hidden behind language and procedure while eroding certainty. She told them she could take a look. The offer surprised them. It surprised her as well. She had meant it reflexively, a habit formed by years of seeing problems as puzzles to be solved. Only later, as she invited them inside to warm up, did she realize she had not mentioned payment. They sat at her small table, hands wrapped around mugs she filled with hot water and tea. The house absorbed their presence without complaint, its warmth steady, its walls indifferent to the weight of new voices. The man spread papers across the table, smoothing them with care, as if they might tear under scrutiny. She read in silence, deeds from decades past, notices stamped with dates and codes, language that was precise without being clear, authoritative without being humane. She recognized the structure immediately, the way the documents were designed to discourage rather than assist. As she read, something in her shifted. This was not business. There was no margin here, no negotiation strategy, no upside. There was only the question of whether these two people would lose the place they called home because they didn't know how to argue with ink and seals. She told them she would help. They tried to refuse. The man shook his head, insisting they could not afford her services. The woman looked down, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. She stopped them gently, her voice firmer than she intended. This was not about money, she said. Not this time. The work took days, longer than she expected. She drove to county offices she had visited before, this time without an assistant, without the protective distance of professional detachment. She stood in lines, filled out forms, requested archives. She argued calmly when dismissed, persisted when redirected. She knew the language, knew when to press and when to wait. At night, she returned to the house exhausted in a way she had not felt in years. Her mind was sharp, focused, engaged in a way it had not been when she fought for stalled developments. This fight felt different. The stakes were clear, human, unabstracted by contracts. She uncovered the problem eventually. An old surveying error, never corrected, compounded by decades of bureaucratic neglect. The solution was tedious but possible. Corrections filed, taxes recalculated, notices rescinded. It required patience, and more than once she felt the familiar frustration rise, but she pushed through it. When it was done, she drove to the couple's land to tell them. The woman cried quietly, pressing her hands together as if in prayer. The man stood still, his face lined with relief too deep for words. They thanked her again and again, their gratitude sincere and almost overwhelming. She waved it off, uncomfortable with the attention. It had not felt like generosity, she realized. It had felt like using her skills for what they were meant to do. A few days later, they returned. She saw them from the window first, a truck pulling up slowly, its tires crunching over frozen ground. When she stepped outside, she noticed the movement in the back of the vehicle, the soft, uneasy shifting. The man cleared his throat. They wanted to thank her properly, he said. Before she could respond, he opened the tailgate. A cow stood there, large and calm, her breath steaming in the cold air. Beside her, pressed close, was a calf, smaller and more alert, eyes wide and curious. For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood. She stared, then looked back at them. They were serious. This was their gift. She protested immediately. This was too much. She could not accept it. She had no barn, no experience, no intention of becoming responsible for animals. The woman shook her head gently. They insisted. This was what they had to give. It was not money, but it was value. It was life. She felt something tighten in her chest, a sensation she had no name for. In all her years of transactions, No one had ever offered her something that required care rather than management. She told them she could not. She meant it. The thought of it terrified her. The man met her gaze. "If you refuse," he said quietly, "you refuse us. We do not have another way to say thank you." The words settled heavily. She looked at the animals again. The cow stood patiently, untroubled by the uncertainty unfolding around her. The calf nudged her side, trusting without understanding. Against every rational calculation she had ever made, she nodded. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and learning. She rearranged space beneath the low roof extension, clearing away stored wood, creating shelter where there had been none intended for living creatures. The earth there held warmth, the roof breaking the wind. It was imperfect, but it was better than she expected. She learned quickly because she had to. Feeding schedules. Water that could not freeze. Simple care that demanded consistency. Her body ached in new ways, her hands roughened, her sleep shortened. Doubt followed her through each task, whispering that this was foolish, unsustainable. Yet each morning, the animals were there, alive, calm, depending on her. She realized then that she had crossed a line she could not easily retreat from. This was no longer a temporary inconvenience or an experiment born of desperation. It was responsibility, unmediated by contracts or clauses. As winter deepened, the house held its warmth. The animals settled into their shelter, steam rising from their bodies in the cold. She stood watching them one evening, the sky darkening, snow beginning to fall, and felt the strange weight of something real taking shape. She had helped without calculation, and in return, she had been given something she did not know how to measure. The responsibility settled into her life, not as a single moment of decision, but as a series of small, unavoidable tasks that refused to be postponed. The cow and the calf did not care that she had once negotiated contracts worth more than the land beneath their hooves. They did not care that she had never intended to stay here this long. They required food, water, shelter, and attention, and they required them every day, without exception. The first week was the hardest. She moved through it with the stiff caution of someone afraid of making an irreversible mistake. She rose before daylight, the house still dark and quiet, and dressed in layers that smelled faintly of smoke and wool. Outside, the cold met her without ceremony. The sky was pale and empty, the land frozen into stillness. She learned the ground beneath the low roof extension better than any room she had ever lived in. The earth there was compacted and dry, protected from snow and wind by the slope of the roof that descended toward the soil. She cleared what had once been storage space, dragging away old logs and tools she had not yet sorted. Her breath came out in thick clouds as she worked, her hands aching, her shoulders burning. The animals watched her with patient curiosity. The cow's eyes were steady, unreadable, her movements slow and deliberate. The calf stayed close to her, stepping uncertainly at first, then with growing confidence. When the space was ready, such as it was, the animals accepted it without complaint. They did not resist the unfamiliar shelter. They did not panic. They settled. That surprised her more than anything else. She expected chaos. She expected noise, damage, the sense that she was barely holding things together. Instead, the days began to fall into order. Not easily, and not without error, but steadily. She learned how much hay was enough, and how much was waste. She learned to break ice from water troughs before it grew too thick, to check on the animals even when exhaustion tempted her to stay inside just a little longer. Her hands grew rougher, her nails cracked, her back protested every evening. Yet the work followed a logic she could feel rather than calculate. Milk came slowly at first. She fumbled with unfamiliar tools, spilled more than she kept, cursed softly at her own clumsiness. The cow tolerated her with quiet patience, as if she understood that this was not malice but ignorance. Each small success felt disproportionate to its scale. A full container, a clean process, a task completed without mistake. She brought the milk inside and stood in the warmth of the house, watching steam rise from it. The smell was rich, alive, nothing like the sanitized products she had bought for years without thought. She tasted it hesitantly, then again, surprised by its fullness. She did not think of profit then. She thought only of sustenance. As the weeks passed, her routine solidified. The house adjusted around it, accommodating the rhythm as if it had been waiting for it all along. Heat from the animals beneath the roof extension added to the warmth retained by the earth. The interior temperature remained steady, even on nights when the cold outside felt punishing. She began to understand the structure not as separate parts, but as a system that responded to use. Neighbors noticed, not all at once, and not with enthusiasm. A man from down the road stopped one afternoon, leaning against his truck, asking casual questions that were not entirely casual. She answered simply, without defensiveness. Yes, the animals were hers. Yes, she was staying through the winter. No, she did not have plans beyond that. Word traveled slowly, but it traveled. Someone asked about milk. Someone else asked about cheese, a skill she had barely begun to attempt. She said no more often than yes, cautious not to promise what she could not deliver. When she did agree, the exchanges were small, informal. A jar returned empty with a few bills tucked inside. A nod of thanks. Nothing written, nothing guaranteed. The income was modest, almost negligible by the standards she once measured herself against. Yet it was real. It arrived without negotiation, without delay, without dependence on approvals or signatures. It did not grow quickly, but it did not vanish overnight either. She began to notice the difference in herself most clearly when she drove into town. The noise felt louder now, the urgency forced. Conversations that once energized her now seemed oddly detached from anything tangible. People complained about delays, about costs, about systems that refused to cooperate. She listened, but she no longer felt the same urgency to fix it all. Back at the house, her evenings were quiet. She cooked simply, ate slowly, slept deeply. The exhaustion she felt was earned, not extracted. Her thoughts no longer spiraled endlessly through contingencies and projections. There were still worries, of course. Animals could fall ill. Winter could worsen. Money was still tight. But these worries had edges. They could be addressed, prepared for, endured. One evening after a particularly cold day, she stood beneath the roof extension, watching the animals settle for the night. Snow fell steadily beyond the shelter, piling against the slope of the roof, sliding down harmlessly. The cow exhaled, her breath rising in a soft plume. The calf shifted closer to her, comforted by her presence. She felt a quiet sense of recognition. This was what the house had been designed for. Not just shelter, but integration. Human life and animal life protected together, the heat of one supporting the other, the earth itself acting as insulation. It was not efficient in the way modern designs claimed efficiency. It was resilient. The thought followed her inside, lingering as she banked the fire and prepared for sleep. She lay awake for a while, listening to the muffled sounds of wind outside, aware of the steady warmth around her. The house was not impressive. It did not scale. It would never be replicated in a development brochure. But it worked. In the days that followed, she caught herself thinking differently about value. She no longer measured success solely by growth or expansion. Stability began to matter more. Predictability. The absence of constant threat. She realized that for years she had confused motion with progress, activity with purpose. Here, progress was quieter. It showed itself in full hay racks, in animals that remained healthy through the cold, in shelves slowly filling with jars she had processed herself. It showed itself in the way her body adapted, becoming stronger, more capable, less brittle. She did not romanticize it. There were moments of doubt, days when fatigue pressed heavily, nights when the wind howled louder than usual, and she lay awake, listening. But even then, the house held. It did not promise ease. It promised endurance. She remembered the list she had once made, the one that ended every option in failure. Sell the house, demolish the house, build new. None of those lines had accounted for this. None had imagined a solution that did not pass through the market first. The house had begun to work not because she had invested more money into it, but because she had stopped trying to force it into a framework it did not belong to. She had allowed it to be what it was, and in return, it supported a life she had not known she was capable of living. As winter tightened further, she understood that this was no longer an experiment. It was a way forward, modest and unremarkable to anyone passing by, but solid beneath her feet. The house was no longer merely shelter. It was a partner in survival, quiet and steadfast, doing what it had always done when given the chance. The winter arrived without ceremony, as if it had been waiting patiently for its moment. There was no single storm that announced it, no dramatic shift that could be marked on a calendar. Instead, the cold deepened day by day, the light shortened, and the land seemed to draw inward, conserving what little warmth it could. By January, even the people who had lived here all their lives spoke of it with a quiet respect. They said it was shaping up to be one of the harshest winters in years. She felt it too, not as fear, but as a tightening awareness that everything she now depended on would be tested. The nights grew longer and darker. The wind changed, no longer sharp and passing, but heavy and persistent, pressing against walls and roofs as if searching for weakness. Snowstorms followed one another in close succession, burying roads, isolating properties, stretching the patience and resources of everyone who lived beyond the reach of immediate help. In town, the mood shifted. Conversations that once revolved around inconvenience now centered on survival. Heating costs climbed to numbers people were unprepared for. Pipes froze and burst in houses that had been built less than a decade earlier, their sleek designs offering little resistance once systems failed. Power outages became common, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes days. She heard about it when she drove in for supplies, listening quietly as people compared damage and expenses. Someone mentioned a neighbor who had to leave his house entirely after the heating system collapsed. Another spoke bitterly about repair crews that could not reach them in time. Each time, she returned to her own road with a growing sense of disbelief. The house endured. The thick walls continued to hold the cold at bay, releasing warmth slowly, evenly. The firewood she had worried would not last seemed to burn more efficiently here, each log giving more than she expected. The roof shed snow before it could accumulate dangerously, its low angle preventing the heavy loads that crushed barns and garages elsewhere. Beneath the roof extension, the animals remained calm. Their presence added a subtle, living warmth to the structure, their breath and bodies contributing to the balance the house maintained so naturally. She checked on them often, sometimes waking in the night just to reassure herself that they were still there, still safe. Each time she found them settled, untroubled. One night, a storm arrived with such force that it woke her from sleep. The wind roared across the land, driving snow hard against the roof. The sound was constant, overwhelming, filling the darkness. She lay awake, listening, her mind cataloging every possible failure. Roof damage, blocked access, a fallen tree cutting off the road entirely. Yet even as the storm raged, The house did not tremble. The sound outside remained distant, muted by the earth and wood surrounding her. She wrapped herself in a blanket and waited, not sleeping, but not panicking either. Somewhere in that long night, she realized that she trusted the house more than she trusted any structure she had ever lived in before. Morning came slowly. When she opened the door, the world beyond it was unrecognizable. Snow lay in deep drifts, sculpted by the wind into sharp ridges and smooth valleys. The sky was pale and empty, the air so cold it burned her lungs. She stepped out carefully, testing the ground, half expecting to be trapped. The entrance was clear. The roof had done its work. She moved through her routine deliberately, feeding the animals, checking water, replenishing hay. Her movements were slower now, measured, but there was no sense of urgency bordering on panic. The house had weathered the night. It would weather this day as well. As the weeks passed, the pattern repeated itself. Storms came and went. The town struggled. Systems failed. Repairs lagged. Tempers frayed. She offered help when she could, sharing what she had learned, lending small assistance that did not cost her stability. She did not advertise her success. She simply lived. There was a moment, late in the season, when the truth became impossible to ignore. She had driven into town after a particularly severe cold snap and returned exhausted, the road barely passable, her hands numb from clearing snow. As she stood by the fire that evening, thawing slowly, she caught sight of herself reflected faintly in the dark window. She looked different, not younger, not stronger in any obvious way, but steadier, grounded. She thought back to the plans she had made when she first bought the property. Demolition, new construction, clean lines, and modern materials designed to appeal to buyers who would never stay long enough to know the land. Those plans had seemed logical, inevitable. Now, they felt strangely hollow. She understood then that the house had not survived despite being unwanted. It had survived because it was unwanted, because it had never been forced to conform to standards that valued appearance over function, growth over resilience. It existed outside the market's logic, and in doing so, it had outlasted it. The realization did not come with triumph. There was no sense of victory over those who had dismissed the place. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. She had been wrong, and the cost of that mistake had been her former certainty. In its place was something more durable. One evening, as winter began its slow retreat and the light lingered a little longer each day, she sat at the table where she had once spread out plans and budgets. She looked at them now without attachment. The figures that once defined success no longer held the same power. They described a life that no longer fit. She folded the papers and put them away. The decision not to build the modern house was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no moment that demanded witness. It was simply the recognition that she did not need to replace what already worked. The house did not ask to be improved. It asked to be understood. As spring approached, the land began to soften. Snow receded, revealing ground dark with moisture and promise. The animals grew restless, sensing the change. She planned cautiously, thinking not in terms of expansion, but continuity. What she had now was enough. The house stood as it always had, unchanged, unremarkable to anyone passing by. Yet to her, it had become the measure of everything that followed. It had outlasted bureaucracy, market shifts, and the collapse of carefully constructed plans. It had not offered wealth or status. It had offered shelter, stability, and a way to live that did not depend on permission. In the end, she understood the truth with a clarity that surprised her. Of all the projects she had ever taken on, this was the only one that had survived intact. Not because she had controlled it, but because she had learned when to step aside. The house no one wanted had endured the winter, and in doing so, it had quietly redefined what success meant. If this story made you stop and think, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming next. Watch the other videos and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.